Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings that you pour out on us each and every day. We thank you especially for your wonderful word. Help us to understand more and more what you want for our lives, your will, and help us to accomplish it. In the most precious name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so we're looking at the Apocrypha. Since you're all kidding me about my accent there. The Apocrypha were some books that were written in Greek that came between the Old and the New Testaments. And I have an article here we're going to go through and read it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple of the books. We're going to start, first of all, with the Book of Maccabees, because it's probably the most significant book in the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is not in our canon. Now, the canon are the official books of the Bible. But I'll read a quote from you later on in this article. Martin Luther said, even though it wasn't part of the official books, they were important books for historical reasons. And that's what I want to kind of set up for you today, why they're important because of the history that we can learn from them and how they set up the New Testament. Okay? And we're going to see some very significant things during this time period. The Jewish faith feel that the Apocrypha are not part of their Bible. They end with the book of Ezra. And they said these books were not accepted. Okay? Roman Catholics do have some of these books. Some of them are not accepted even by the Roman Catholics. Okay? So we're going to look at that first article. If you could turn to the page that says the Old Testament Apocrypha. Cookie.
Nope. I don't have glasses.
The books called the Apocrypha consist of 14 books originally attached to the Greek Old Testament that were not in the Hebrew written Bible. That is because they were first written in the Greek language. That is true for most of the books of the Apocrypha. They were written first in Greek, not in Hebrew. There is some question when we come to the Book of Maccabees whether that was originally written in Greek or in Hebrew. And the only reason we have no copies of the Book of Maccabees in Hebrew, it's only because there was a church father. Church fathers, when we use that term, are people who were very significant in the early church, and his name was Origen. And Origen said in one of his writings that he saw the Hebrew book of Maccabees. So there was a possibility that it was written in Greek and then translated into Hebrew, or it could have been the other way around. When we come to the book of Maccabees, it's very much related to the times of the day. Okay? And there are some inconsistencies and some errors historically in the book that I'm going to show you. Now, they're not correct, but what they tell us is what the people of the day were thinking about. Okay? It's what was the common knowledge of the day. Okay? So they're going to, at one point, they're going to talk about Alexander the Great and how after his death, his three generals split up the three areas. Basically, that's a true statement, okay? But historically, we know it's different than that. But that's what the people of the day believed, okay? The other thing you should always know about is in Hebrew, when you see numbers, oftentimes numbers are either exaggerated for some sort of purpose, or they have some symbolic meaning behind them. Okay, we are in our society. We're very Roman and Greek thinking. Hebrew is a very different way of thinking, and you have to understand that. Otherwise, you get into trouble when you start trying to translate and look at the Bible. Okay, so for example, with numbers. 12 was a holy number. 7 was a number of completion. So they didn't have superlatives. So if they wanted to say something was really complete, they would say 7 times 7. Or Remember when Jesus is asked, how many times do I have to forgive? 7 times 70. That can also be translated 77. Okay? He meant it's a complete number. You just keep going, 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 going. Okay? And also they weren't so time-oriented. They would, if it was part of a week, they'd say a week. You can't get hung up on those little things. People try to use those little things to disprove the scriptures, and it's a different way of thinking, okay? And they estimated crowds. So they might say there was 3,000 soldiers out there. Now they can go out and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was a general number, okay? If somebody said to me today, how many people were in first service, I say 156, because I know exactly that's what it was. No, I don't know. Okay. It was about 150. About 150 people looking at it, and that's what they often did. So numbers were that way, okay? So we have these 14 books. Some of them are accepted, some are not. We're going to get to that, okay? They were considered scripture and used as such by the Jews of the dispersion. Now, what are these Jews of the dispersion? Those were Jewish people who weren't living in Israel. They were the dispersion. They would disperse out into the area. And it seems like at the time of Jesus, the Apocrypha was very much used in those outlying areas. Okay? There's going to come a time when that changes, and we're going to get to that in just a minute. Okay? So at the time of Jesus, you have this Greek Apocrypha. Now, remember that the world leaders are trying to get everyone to be what they called Hellenized. And that's really what the Book of Maccabees is all about. Because the ruler of the area wanted everyone to dress alike, think alike, common language, common holidays, so that everybody was equal. Come on in. We're going to get a couple more chairs up here for you. Where am I? Tuna, yeah. You get seats right up front.
Is that
Yeah.
what Hellenization means?
Hellenization means that they wanted everyone to be Hellenized, to be all the same, to be Greek.
Yeah.
Greek thinking, Greek speaking. Benita, can you
Yeah, sure. I'd love to hear that for you, dear.
I'll just take out these first two, and then can you...
Yeah, I'll clear it.
Okay, we're talking about the Apocrypha, and this is, I'm reading here, Apocrypha. I know. You just had to get used to my accent. I'm sorry, that's the way it's going to be for the rest of my life. I'm too old to change.
Did your wife tell you that?
What?
Did your wife ever tell you that?
Yeah, my wife tells me that all the time. You're too old.
That's what I thought. I have a wife.
Oh, you meant the whole thing, too old to change? Yeah. Okay. So we've looked, so this Apocrypha, 14 books written in Greek, used outside of Israel. Second paragraph I'm reading. About 60 years after the crucifixion of Christ, a group of rabbis, survivors of the Roman annihilation of Jerusalem. So when does Rome come in and devastate Jerusalem, destroy Jerusalem? 70 AD. So this is right around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? Probably a little bit after it. Jesus would have been around 30 when he died. Some people say 33. Again, you got to be careful with numbers. Okay? So 60 years later would be around 90. About 10, 15, 20 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? They met at a place called Jamnia and canonized a Hebrew scripture specifically devoid of Greek writing. So what's happened now is basically the Jewish nation has been destroyed. The temple is gone. It's never going to be rebuilt It has not been rebuilt since that time. Now, this council, when we think of like the Council of Nicaea, they came out with the Nicene Creed, okay? And we had the apostles having a council in Jerusalem, the Council of Jerusalem. They made decisions. It isn't the same with the Hebrew, okay? There was a school there in Jamnia, and a lot of the Jewish scholars who survived the Holocaust in Jerusalem moved there. It's right on the coast of Israel. And they moved there and opened up a rabbinical school. And they're discussing what scriptures should be in the Bible and what should not. A lot of scholars today will look at that and say, this is when it was officially canonized, or said, these are the books of the Old Testament. It probably didn't happen quite that way. It happened much more like the New Testament canonization. They kind of argued about it, and they discussed it, and then finally they came to some sort of agreement of which ones. And they said, these books, since they were originally written in Greek, should not be included in the Hebrew Old Testament. Even though they're part of their history, they're not part of the scriptures. So the Jewish people would handle it very much like Christians do, okay? It's nice historically, but it's not part of our Bible. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. So the other thing that comes out of this time period in Jamnia is they're really starting to say, if you're a Christian, you can't be part of our Jewish faith. They're really separating Christianity and Judaism at this time. Because remember, Paul is still proclaiming, and where does Paul go, first of all, when he goes to one of his mission starts? Do you know? In the New Testament? He always goes to the temple first. He goes to the synagogue, and he starts in the synagogue with his teaching. And then when they won't accept him, then he moves out and starts with the Romans and Greeks.
Who has to say?
Up here. Gustafson. Okay. I don't have any more binders, but just bring these back the next time. And
There's with all the maps and everything.
okay, that's with all the maps and everything. They don't need the
Oh, they don't have dump sheets?
top sheets now.
Okay, that's all right.
Okay. Am I confusing you all? You're very quiet today.
We're enthralled.
Okay. Very good. All right.
That's right. That's her favorite.
I'm on the third paragraph. This codification of the Hebrew Bible, it means to codify, means to authorize or to say what is in and what is out. Okay? We would say the canon. Codification is what makes the canon. What's in the Bible, what's not in the Bible. Canceled for the Jews the authority, not only of the contested books we now call apocryphal, but also the popular Greek Old Testament itself that foreign Jews had been using for the previous 300 years. So a lot of the Jews had the Bible translated into Greek, and especially down in Egypt, which had the next largest number of Jews living in Egypt. And that's interesting because where does Mary and Joseph flee to?
Egypt.
To Egypt. Because Alexandria had the largest number of Jews living outside of Israel at that time. Not only that, now listen to this. When we come to the Book of Maccabees, and I'll point this out again to you, the Persians come in and they say you can no longer worship the way you want. You have to be Greek. You can no longer circumcise, no longer read the scriptures, no longer have any of the feasts. Okay? So the Maccabean family are going to revolt. But the high priest of that time leaves Israel. He goes into exile. Guess where he goes?
Egypt.
Egypt to Alexandria and sets up a temple in Alexandria, as opposed to the temple in Israel. Okay? This is going to cause a problem even up to the time of Jesus, because you're going to have two competing fractions who say, no, this should be the high priest, and they're going to say, no, this should be the high priest. Okay? This should be the king, no, this should be the king. And we're going to see that in just a minute, I think. Okay? When I get to that. Okay. Jamnia was a seminal decision because it isolated Christians from Jews on the basis not just of scripture, but of language as well. So the early Christians are writing all their New Testament in the Greek. Why would they want to write in Greek rather than Hebrew?
Was the language of the day.
It was an international language. Okay? It's interesting to me that when Benita and I travel, there are so many people, wherever we go, that speak English. It seems like English has become an international language nowadays. Okay? We had a funny incident. When we got to our, we spent 3 months, some of you might not know this, we spent 3 months in Germany serving the congregation that Pastor Braun came from. And he warned us, he said, what they do, like United Parcel with packages and stuff, they ring the doorbells, and whoever answers, that's who they deliver it to.
Back up, we lived in an apartment building.
An apartment,
And
yeah.
there were 6 units in the apartment.
Yeah.
Nobody has a single house in Germany. There are no such thing as single houses.
Yeah, we saw nobody. That everything was attached in Frankfurt. Okay, so this guy rings the doorbell, and I go to answer the door, and I'm trying to talk to him in German. He's trying to talk to me. We can't. We're just having a terrible time. I'm thinking my German is so bad he doesn't understand a thing I'm saying. And Benita walks up behind me and says, "Oh, what's going on, Alan?" And he looks at me and he says, "Do you speak English?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Where are you from?" I said, "America." He says, "I'm Croatian." And he's speaking all of this in English. He says, "I'm Croatian." He said, "I just arrived. My German is terrible." I can converse very well in English. And I'm like, okay, let's go. Okay, here we have someone from Croatia. Thank you. And America meet up in Germany, and what do we use? English, Yeah, it is. So for the time of Jesus, okay, and the early disciples, the language, if you wanted multiple people to be able to read it, would be Greek. So they wrote everything in Greek. Okay? Later it will be translated into Latin, but not at the beginning. All of our original New Testament writings are in Greek. Okay? That also helps us to kind of tell the authorship when we're looking at the New Testament books, because Greek is such a very specific language. You can tell who has good Greek skills and who do not amongst the disciples. Okay? Very interesting. Okay, so let's see here. I guess on the last paragraph. Mm-hmm. The early Christians had good reason for the decision to retain the Greek scriptures. Not only did the entire pagan world speak Greek, but according to the Talmud. Now what's this Talmud? The Talmud is the teaching of the rabbis. Okay? At the time Jesus preached, Hebrew and Greek scrolls hung side by side in Herod's temple. So even in the temple in those days, they had Hebrew and Greek. After the destruction of the temple, that's when they start saying, listen, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't allow the Greeks to influence us. We're going back to Hebrew. Okay? So there's kind of a reactionary feel after that time. We don't want to have anything to do with those people. Even the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran. Everybody know what the Dead Sea Scrolls are? Or do I need to explain that? Yeah. Okay. Include fragments written in both languages, both in Hebrew and in Greek. When Christ's disciples wrote the New Testament books, they too were composed in the same Greek language, allowing the world at large to read them. The Jewish action fixated as it was on the Greek language, nullified both sets of Christian books. The New Testament and the Apocryphal books were both relegated to pagan classification and permanently discarded. So they said, we're not going to have anything to do with them. Okay? And in fact, I said something before to you about the Jewish people still see this as historical. That would be true of Reformed Jews. Some of the Orthodox Jews would say that Apocrypha is just a fairy tale. It's just fantasy. Okay? We do know historically that the Book of Maccabees is very, very good historically. Very accurate historically. Okay? The early Christian church in the first century quickly coalesced into two Roman churches, one in the east, which we call today Eastern Orthodox, and the other in the west, now called Roman Catholic. Both adopted the Greek Old Testament. Owing, however, to the nature of some of the material and questions raised by the Jewish rabbis at Jamnia, the Roman Catholic Church did so with reservations. It was obvious to Catholic scholars that some of those apocryphal documents, though dating from antiquity, were less than inspired. So even the Roman Catholic Church said, we're not quite sure about this, but we're going to include them in the Bible. Okay? And you know, of course, that at one point there was just the Christian church, and then it split to the east and to the west. Okay? And the Eastern Orthodox churches would be Russian, Greek Orthodox. That would be all.
What would Coptic be?
Coptic would be Eastern Orthodox churches. Okay? We have one here. We have an Eastern Orthodox church in Sugar Land. It's over, is it Derry Ashford? It's right off of 90, and it's called the 30 Holy Martyrs or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I
think
see,
it's
I
called
drew,
40.
it's on Elkins.
40. Is it 40?
Yeah,
Is it Elkins?
Elkins.
Yeah.
I've been
Yeah.
there a couple times.
Yeah.
Eldridge.
Eldridge. Eldridge.
The main
Yeah.
drag going
Yeah.
down there.
Yeah. So there are Greek Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches in the area. The strongest motivation for these reservations, however, came from the fact that in the writings of the apostles, almost all of the Old Testament book quotations used to emphasize their points came from books outside of those 14. So there is no reference in the New Testament to any of the apocryphal books. So the apostles, the early Christians, were all using what we would call the canon of the Hebrew Bible, not any of these apocryphal books. The other thing, and I don't think it mentions it in this article, is sometimes these books don't even mention God. Okay? When we get to the Book of Maccabees, it never says God. Okay? They're extremely faithful, but they'll say, following the law. It's all about the law, not about God.
Could there be some sort of puzzle, like when we talked about Esther, how in the middle of Esther
Yes.
there was the acrostic?
The acrostic of Yahweh,
Yeah.
God's proper name, is in the Book of Esther, and nowhere else does it mention God in the Book of Esther. I think what it was, and this is my personal opinion, okay, is that by this point in Jewish thinking, the name of God was so holy, we didn't want to use it. So I think they're using something other. Today they would use like God with a small g, or you'll sometimes see writings Yahweh, you'll see Y, ... and then the H, okay? And they won't even say that, okay? They won't say Yahweh, because they're afraid of misusing God's name. And I think that's the Maccabean are using a way of saying God without using his name. But that was one of the reasons some people said, listen, we shouldn't use it. That was one of the reasons for getting rid of the Apocrypha. Okay. Consequently, early Christian scholars assigned those questionable Greek written books to a middle category. So, okay, we can't agree, let's just stick them in the middle. Okay? There is, now we're going to look at the Apocrypha. There is also something called the Pseudo-Apocrypha. And the Pseudo-Apocrypha are books written after the New Testament. Okay? So you got the Old Testament, Apocrypha, New Testament, Pseudo-Apocrypha. Okay. In so doing, they coined the term Apocrypha, which means hidden, to define them. They're hidden in the middle of the book. Okay? The title was not meant to disparage their claim to divine inspiration, but to suggest that their content was more for scholars because of the hidden nature of the revelations they contained. They felt the general public was not sufficiently enlightened to readily understand them. Okay? I would imagine, Jim, I know you have a question, but I would imagine growing up, even in a Roman Catholic church, you probably didn't hear much about the Apocrypha. It was in your Bible, but you didn't hear about it, right?
We didn't hear the term. I knew the term, but I don't know why I knew it.
Okay.
But yeah, it's in the Bible. Seven of the 14 are in the Catholic Bible.
But you didn't hear anything about the Bible.
So you want me to bring my Roman Catholic
No.
Bible?
No, you don't have to because I'm going to print it all out for you.
Okay.
You're going to have it all. Yeah, because a lot of people don't have a Bible with the Apocrypha, and because it might be all different translations, I'm going to print it out for you. And if you'll get that next week.
Pastor Ann's right. Ann's right. We never heard much about the Bible, actually. It was always a Sunday missal.
The missal was like the hymn book, right?
No. The missal contained excerpts from the Bible,
The liturgy.
written
The
in
liturgy, right?
written in such a way that the reader could read them, and they actually translated some of it into sort of the vernacular.
Yeah,
The
okay.
liturgy, though.
Yeah,
During the liturgy, yeah.
Actually-
Never outside the liturgy.
okay. Actually, it was illegal for a Roman Catholic to have a Bible in their home until Vatican II.
Okay.
Until when?
Vatican II.
When was that?
Vatican II was, somebody look it up for me.
1967,
60, yeah.
Yeah, we had one in our home.
Yes,
You had one in your own before that.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. We had one in my home long before that.
yes, a lot of Roman Catholics did, they violated
Yeah.
canon law.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about officially, the Roman Catholic Church said until Vatican II, you were not to have a Bible in your home.
Why?
Didn't know
It's
that.
because
Why?
of
Because-
what you said back here, though, that because of the not being able to interpret it correctly or something.
Right. They said they didn't want people reading and interpreting on their own. They wanted them to come and learn what the priest had to say about it. Yeah, very different. That you got to remember that's a big difference there for many years between Lutherans and Roman Catholics, because Luther said, no, I need to get the Bible into the hands of the people. And not only that, I need to have a good language to do that, so he kind of helped the German language, and he pushed public education because he wanted everybody to read so they could read their Bible.
Did you get
Vatican II
Yeah, it
is
shows 65.
October
65?
62 to 65.
62 to 65, okay.
But what I read is
We've had
Luther's
3
Bible excluded a lot of books like
Yeah.
Revelation,
I used to Google.
Hebrews, and a couple of other books.
Yeah.
Because it,
I
Actually,
used Google, what do you use?
Yeah. Martin, there was a question. Martin Luther's Bible, did he not include all of the Bibles?
Right.
Yeah, he did include them in his translations, but he taught and preached that some of them were not as effective as other ones. And we'll have a quote from him about the Apocrypha here. Yeah, he had a lot of problems with James and with the book of Hebrews.
yeah, and
Okay.
Revelation.
I don't remember Revelations, but also you got to remember, Jim, that was not only Martin Luther. They always point to Martin Luther. That it was a controversy in the church of the time.
Yeah.
Okay, and even the Roman Catholic Church, you know, the one church before the split, they were also arguing on what
Right.
books should be in the canon.
That was kind of his frame of reference too, being
Right.
a priest.
Yeah.
But my other question really, I didn't
Yeah.
ask that yet.
Oh, you mean all that time and I didn't get to your question?
No, my question had to do
Okay.
with the determination of what was the word that was used here? Which ones were inspired? Who
Yeah.
decided which books were inspired?
Well, it seems like it came up through the ranks. So it was like the scholars all got together and kind of discussed this and decided what one should be in and what one shouldn't. We're talking about the Hebrew Bible here.
Yeah.
It wasn't a council like we did councils. The Christian church had a council and we made decisions on what is in and what is out. With the Jewish faith, it kind of came about on its own. Okay.
Does the Greek Orthodox Church
Uh-huh.
still use the Apocrypha?
Yes. Some Greek.
Oh, they
Yeah.
still do?
Yes. Yeah. And to a certain extent, Jim, that's the way it happened in the Christian church too. And sometimes people will say, well, Martin Luther was the one who did this or that. Actually, it was really a discussion of the church at large.
Kind of a consensus.
It was kind of a consensus, yeah. And even then, some of the writings of Luther even, we can't ask him questions. So, and some of the things that he said about James, I heard a scholar one time refute what Luther said, because Luther said James is like a book with a thatched roof. And everybody takes that to mean that it's not very important. But if you look at the time that he was writing in it, thatched roofs were the thing that everybody had.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't mean it wasn't insignificant. It meant it was kind of the topping on the cake. You know, you have all these other books, and then you have James there, kind of the roof. So, yeah. Okay? All right. I think it's the last paragraph, second page. Later in the Middle Ages, the Roman Church, agreeing with what had been up to that time an unofficial policy of acceptance, officially moved a certain group of the apocryphal books back to the regular or recognized scriptures. That is where they remain to this day. True scriptures to Greek and Romans. In the Protestant Church, next page, it is a different matter. When Martin Luther broke with the Catholic Church, he ordered the Greek Apocrypha placed between the Old Testament and the New Testament in his 1534 Bible, with the inscription, Apocrypha. These are book which are not held equal, I think it should say, these are books, which are not held equal to the sacred scriptures, and yet are useful and good for reading. So we don't take doctrine out of them, but we look at them and see what can we learn from these books, because they're part of the history of the church. Okay? As the Protestant Revolt, one more thing I want to go back to. You said something about Martin Luther's Bible. There was many Martin Luther Bibles. He was still updating and translating his Bible even right before his death. And he was always redoing it and adding things and changing things and making it better. So, and there's very few people that use the Martin Luther Bible today, only because we have even better scholarship and more Greek texts than what he had available to him. So we know that there are even better translations than Martin Luther. Did I say that?
Yeah. I heard it's on tape.
Yeah. I think Martin Luther would say right on,
Yeah.
because he was constantly working on it. He wanted the best.
Sure.
And he also, when he translated, he wanted it to be in a language that all the people could understand. And there's one story that he one day couldn't figure out something, so he went down to the local bar, the tavern, and sat down and said, "How would you say?" And he asked people that were around, and then he translated it that way. Reading on, as the Protestant Revolt swept Europe and sects of all sorts began appearing and sparking centuries of bitter Christian warfare, the apocryphal books of the Old Testament were removed entirely from most Protestant Bibles. So even though Martin Luther had it in there, as it continued on, a lot of them just kind of took it out. So it wasn't somebody that said, well, we can't read the Apocrypha anymore, or the Apocrypha isn't important. It's just something that happened. I also, it doesn't say it here, But I also think that maybe part of the reason they took out the Apocrypha is to save some printing costs.
Right.
Oh.
It was very expensive to print these Bibles, you know. The Anglican Church retained them, but with the caution that they are used only for life and instruction of manners, but not to establish any doctrine. Okay, so we're not going to take any biblical truths out of it, the doctrines, but it is good to learn about it and to know what's going on in that day. Today, some Christians and Protestant circles regard the Old Testament Apocrypha as simply fiction or worse. That is an overreaction. I agree with that. When we think about these books in terms of prophecy, many of them remain very valuable. Among them are serious works written by Hebrew scholars and prophets, and the inspiration of these verses is obvious, stemming as most of them do from a century or more before the birth of Jesus. They offer invaluable insight into the Jewish historical process. And that's what we're going to look at. What is this going to tell us historically that sets up what Jesus is going to do? Okay? The Old Testament Apocrypha consists of the following 14 books listed in two categories. Those accepted as scriptures by the Roman and Greek churches, and those that are not accepted as scripture. So even the Roman Catholic Church has some that they say are not acceptable books. So let's look at kind of an overview of these books that are acceptable. So the first one is Ecclesiasticus. Not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus. This book, written about 180 BC, contains proverbs and practical observations of life 2 centuries before the birth of Christ. The work closely resembles the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. It represents one of the most valuable records of early rabbinical thought. It was translated into Greek in 132 BC by a grandson of the author, Jesus ben Sira. So we know who the author of this is. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't anything special. What I would equate this to is Benjamin Franklin's
Poor Richard's Almanac.
Poor Richard's Almanac. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man.
Wealthy and wise.
Yeah. So this Jewish rabbi was gathering all of the kind of proverbs, statements of the day, and put them together in a book.
That book is also called Sirach.
Yes, because Jesus ben Sira wrote it. Okay? What?
Jesus, the word Jesus, does that mean teacher?
No. Jesus is not a Hebrew word. Jesus is a Roman word. Okay? The Hebrew word at the time of Jesus would have been Yeshua. In Old Hebrew, it would have been Joshua. And Joshua means God saves. So it wasn't an uncommon name. Now, that's one of the things that happened is when the New Testament was coming into the Latin word, they used Jesus. They Latinized Yeshua to Jesus, okay, and it stuck. And almost every language. Sometimes, as you're coming down here, you'll hear the Congolese singing, and if you stand out there for a little bit, you'll hear Jesus. It seems like every language kind of adapts that totally, okay? But it meant Jesus saves. It means God saves. Okay? And then wisdom. Sometimes this is called the Wisdom of Solomon. In many respects, this is the most valuable books of the entire Apocrypha. It was written by a Jew of the Dispersia about 65 BC, so about 65 years before the time of Jesus. It is similar to the wisdom books of the Old Testament. It was written especially to combat the materialistic tendencies of the canonical book of Ecclesiastes. So at this point, the Jewish nation was becoming very materialistic. It's all about me, what can I get? Sound familiar? It could be very valuable for us too. If we have enough time, I'm going to go back and look at wisdom, okay? But the first one we're going to look at is Maccabees. Still filled with stunning prophecy and replete with the powerful and spiritual essence of God. This book is also sometimes called the Wisdom of Solomon. And then First Maccabees, that's the one we're going to read first of all. First Maccabees, written by a Jew in Palestine. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know when they wrote it. Some scholars believe it was written during the time of the Maccabean family. Some believe it was written right after. It was probably not written by the Maccabees. It doesn't come across that way. It was probably written by some sort of prophet who was very close to the Maccabean family. Now, the Maccabean family is eventually going to be called the Hasmoneans. Hasmoneans is their family name. I hope to get to this yet today. Maccabees is a nickname. Maccabees, it means the hammer. And when Judith started his revolt against the Persians, they said he was like a hammer. So it got stuck with Maccabees. And then they then the books got named that, and it's kind of the nickname. But the family name is really Hasmonean. And that's significant because the Hasmoneans will play a very significant role in Jesus' life. Want to guess how? I'm not going to tell you. Okay. This is way off the subject, but I used to love to do this with my kids. They'd ask me about something. I said, "Can you keep a secret?" "Yeah, Dad, I can keep a secret." I said, "So can I." Reading on. Okay. In 2nd century BC is perhaps the best historical source on the period from 175 to 135 BC. So that time in between the New and Old Testament. Well written, it reveals deep insight into the root causes of the Maccabean rebellion and details the rebellion itself down to the death of Simon in 135 BC. Simon is going to invite, because he's worried that the Persians are going to come back again, so he invites the Romans to come in and help them out. That's how the Romans eventually take over the Holy Land. Okay, that's where it comes from. And at first it was, just come in and be our advisors. And we're going to make a treaty with you. If someone attacks us, you're going to defend us. Like a lot of the treaties we have, if you get attacked, it's like attacking us. And that's how it all started. And then slowly but surely, the Romans took over more and more and more. Okay? When I look at world history today, I don't wonder why some of the countries like Iran and Iraq, have military presence, and some of the people saying, oh, that's just a way of the United States to get a foothold to take over our country. Because that's part of the history of that part of the world. And even though it's wrong, I can see how there could be that thinking.
That's what they would do
Yeah.
in that instant.
Maybe. Yeah.
Or assuming that
Yeah. Yeah.
everyone.
This book is essential to both Christians and Jews. It gives detailed information relative to Antiochus Epiphanes and his desecration of the Jewish temple. We're going to see that in the book of Maccabees. He comes into the temple, and because he wants everyone to be the same, he's going to sacrifice on the altar. And guess what he sacrifices?
Pig.
We'll get to it. Yeah. An action which Jesus said would be repeated at the end of time. So this fits into the book of Revelations. Okay? The book also contains a wealth of details relative to the Jewish feast of Hanukkah. Hey, we just talked about that, guys. Okay? Which celebrates the rededication of the temple Antiochus debased. So Hanukkah is the celebration, for you who went through my class on the festivals, it's happening during the Book of Maccabees. Okay? Okay, so we're going to see how that all fits together. All right? That information is available from no other source, Jewish or otherwise, and with it, there would be no Hanukkah celebration. Without it. Yes, excuse me. Second Maccabees, unlike the first book of Maccabees, this work is a combination of history and fiction. And we're not even going to look at that. There's so many mistakes in the book historically, and it's kind of like, boy, this is going to sound bad. I don't mean it to be, but it's kind of like somebody took First Maccabees and wrote a comic book for the kids on what happened. You know, it's just, you know, you got heroes and heroines, and you know, it wasn't meant to be historical. It was meant to be a retelling of the story.
So it's based on.
It's
but
based
not-
on, right,
Oh,
a true work based on. Yeah. It seems to be less useful than the first. It is an abridgment of a far more extensive work in existence at the time of his writing in the latter part of the 2nd century BC. So it's written much later. It presents information about the period leading up to the rebellion of the Maccabees under Matthias and Modine, and follows it down to 161 BC. So it's like a prequel to what's happening in the Book of Maccabees. And now Tobit, the Book of Tobit, is a work of fiction, was very popular among Jews and the early Christians. It is a story of romance and legend from the Jewish dispersion in Egypt. So this is the Jewish people in Egypt, and it's a love story. Okay? It was written in the 3rd century BC and was based upon 2 well-known Egyptian stories. So at some point, some Jewish writer took Romeo and Juliet and Taming of the Shrew and put them together in an American setting.
American?
Well,
So-called.
yeah, you know what I'm saying. Okay, took two famous storylines and put them together. Okay, the purpose of this book was to teach useful lessons and at the same time correct some of the then current superstitions. It features prominently the angel Raphael. And this is where you get all of the medieval paintings of the angel Raphael. Not from the scriptures, from Tobit, from the Apocrypha. Okay? Bel and the Dragon, written about 100 years before the time of Christ. This story reveals Daniel's wisdom in exposing the falsehood of idolatry and those who promote it. The book also reveals the existence in Babylon of a dragon god. Information about this idol is available from no other source, but is particularly relevant in light of dragon prophecies relative to the last days scattered throughout the scriptures. Now that didn't mean literally a dragon, it was figurative of evil, like we see in the book of Revelations. Tobit, the book of Tobit, relates a story of victory won by the chosen people over his enemy, thanks to the intervention of a woman.
You said Tobit.
Oh, I'm sorry, Judith. Judith. The book of Judith relates a story of victory won by the chosen people over its enemy, thanks to the intervention of a woman. It is a legendary tale of a Jewish widow, reminiscent of Joan of Arc, who succeeds in outwitting and finally slaying a great Assyrian general, thus bringing deliverance to her oppressed people. It was written in Palestine during the latter half of the 2nd century BC, probably by a Pharisee. Pharisee was one of the scribes, Pharisees. Okay. The story just, it fits into the middle of the book of Maccabees. Just to give you a kind of a little background, the Persians are surrounding Jerusalem, and it looks like they're going to be defeated. And Judith, this widow, sneaks out of camp, sneaks out of Jerusalem, and brings with her wine and fine foods, and goes to the general and says, I want to defect. Gets him drunk, he's in bed, she takes his sword, cuts off his head, sneaks out of the Persian camp, puts it on a pole in front of Jerusalem. The troops all come up, they see their general's head, and they panic and leave. So it's one of the victories of the Maccabean Revolt by a woman. So we don't include that.
Oh, sure.
Okay. Now, this Esther is similar to our Old Testament Esther, but there's some additional verses. So it's kind of an add-on. Written about 100 BC, consists of a number of additions to the biblical book of Esther. The additions were added for detail and to make up some of the spiritual deficiencies of the canonical book. Remember, Esther is one of the books that doesn't mention God. So this writer said, well, it's a good book, but we got to add a little bit more to it. Okay? The added verses greatly enhance the apocalyptic nature of the story and bring enormous symbolic understanding to it, dramatically enhancing its relationship to God. It is replete with dragons and images easily reminiscent of the most important tenets and personages involved in the last day warfare between Satan and Christ. The symbolism it brings to the book of Esther is powerful prophecy. So it's kind of, it gets into the fantasy again, okay? It's the, and that's why a lot of Jewish scholars don't even think Esther should be in the Old Testament. So it really is not well received. Baruch, the greater part of this book, written in the 1st century AD under the assumed name of Baruch, the private secretary of Jeremiah. The 6th chapter is known as the Epistle of Jeremiah. Both books contain a series of exhortations, encouragements, and severe denunciations. I'm going to start next week with the books not accepted because I have my, I'm at the end of my time. But I just want to look ahead with you for a little bit, just to give you a little bit of a teaser. And I have these actually big, so you can see them. This kingdom all here, can you all see?
Yeah.
If I hold it up? And you have it in your book, okay? The Seleucid Empire, they're the ones who were controlling Israel during this time period. Okay? And then look at how small the Roman Empire is. You got the Greeks all here, and this is all the Ptolemaic, which is Egypt. So all of this area plus here and a little bit here. Okay? So that's why it's so significant. This chart here, as we go through the book of Maccabees, all of these areas that are listed here are going to be talked about in the book of Maccabees. So when we get to there, just kind of pull this out and hold it to the side, and as we're reading through, you can say, oh, that's where it is, that's where it is, that's where it is. Okay, it's going to give you all of those guidelines. Then the next page is all the rulers, and we'll talk about them because they're significant, okay, in history. But the last two I want you to see, the Hasmonean dynasty. If you look at the top, the book of Maccabees will start with a priest by the name of Mattathias. Mattathias has 5 sons, okay, and their Judas Maccabee, Judas Matthias, is going to be the one to first lead the revolt. But what I want you to see is if you go down the chart, almost to the end, who's there?
Herod the Great.
Herod the Great.
Yep.
So Herod the Great is a descendant of this Maccabean family we're going to learn about. Okay? Oh, wait a minute. Okay.
It's in there.
Yeah, it's in there. Go back to the rulers in the Hellenistic and Maccabean eras, that other one. I said we'll talk about it. Okay. This is, okay.
people chart.
Oh, yeah, they say go back to one. Go back to this.
People's are red. I thought they did, but it's red.
That's not the chart I want. I will bring it next week. I'm missing something here. The Maccabees are also related to the high priest of Jesus. Okay? So both the king and the high priest come from this Maccabean family we're going to talk about. Okay? Just to give you an idea of what's coming. Okay, anything else before we close? Okay. And I will have books made up for you. How many people do not have a binder book today that want one? Let me see hands. One. Just one? Two?
Three.
Oh, here's one? Oh, I got a binder, okay. Three? Okay. I'll make up some
I
more.
write on mine, and you don't, you write on yours.
Yeah, actually, if you look at the Book of Maccabees, just kind of flip to the back, any one of those pages, you'll see what I've done is I've given you good margins, so you can write in all the margins. That's what I always, when I'm studying the scriptures, what I do, I make up a booklet, like this, and I write in all of the margins. This one not so much, but some of them I have a huge margin, and I can write all my notes in it. Okay?
My bread,
What? By red? Yeah. Yeah.
He's colorblind.
You're a great student. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Yeah, Jane, I'll tell him.
Let's close with a word of prayer and our benediction. Heavenly Father, thank you for this wonderful word, the history of your people. Thank you for a people who are willing to even die for their faith, because that's what the Maccabean family was willing to do. They were willing to give up their lives, their whole livelihood to preserve the faith that you wanted to be passed down. And it helps us to understand how much Jesus meant to the people and the importance of having that Messiah. We thank and praise you for that. Just continue to open our hearts and mind that we truly might be the people you want us to be. We ask this all in his most precious name. Amen. Amen. Receive the benediction of our Lord. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you his peace. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Have a great week.